Welcome to Group Talk. 4 shows, 1 podcast from the Small Group Network focusing on topics relevant to small group ministries. Whether you're in a church of 100 or 10,000, whether you're a volunteer or staff, we want to support, encourage, and equip you to lead well. So relax, listen, and enjoy Here to There with Carolyn and Taketa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Here to There, where we explore movement from our present reality to the future that God has for us. Since the pandemic started in early March of 2020, gosh, it seems like forever, the word digital has been used constantly to describe the activities of our lives, how we work, how we do school, how we learn, shop, worship, and connect with others. Basically, digital is largely how we now engage with the world and everything in it. And this has been a huge paradigm shift, but actually, I think it was well on its way, especially for our younger generations, even before the pandemic, but COVID certainly has forced it into the fabric of life for everyone. So digital life is not an option anymore, but it really is the reality for most of us and for our churches. So most churches by now have developed lots of online content, broadcasts, live stream services, of social media, video Bible studies, and online small groups and volunteer trainings. But what does all this mean for discipleship? Can digital discipleship be as effective as being done in person? And does making disciples digitally require something fundamentally different? Or is it just a change in medium with the same message? This is so important because even after COVID is under control and more people return to church buildings, we'll most likely be using a hybrid of both physical and digital space. So we need to get better at making disciples through the digital medium and taking advantage of its benefits as well as overcoming its challenges. So here to help us think through some of these issues related to making disciples digitally is Bart Shaw. Bart, thank you so much for being on Here to There.
Hey, thanks, Carolyn, for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about Bart, because Bart's a newer friend. I'm so excited to talk with him today. Since 2017, Bart has been serving at Traders Point Christian Church, which is a multi-site congregation in Indianapolis, Indiana, with 5 campuses. He's been their lead groups minister, campus pastor for their 2,000 plus site, and on their leadership team. So prior to that, though, Bart had ministered for 12 years. He looks so young. You guys can't see him, but he looks young. But apparently, he has 12 years as a discipleship and teaching pastor in northern Indiana. He is born and bred Indiana, yes?
Yep, absolutely.
So Bart has served in both small and mid-sized churches with Sunday school models and small groups, and now he's at a mega church of 10,000 plus with 450 small groups. He has a wide range of church experience, which is really helpful to us. And he's also a certified life coach and trained in 3DM discipleship ministry. Hey, what is that?
It's just an arm of the church that empowers churches how to make disciples. And so they walk through Jesus's model methodology, and it's super helpful. It helped us a ton at the church I was at previously to make disciples who make disciples.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so you've been dealing with this topic for a long time, pre-pandemic. Okay, so Bart is also part of our small group network, Huddle in Indianapolis, and we actually met at the Lobby Conference in 2018. So Bart, I think that was your first small group network event, right?
Yeah, I chuckle. It was actually this last year, Carolyn, in 2020. It feels like 3 years, but it was this past year.
It was, you're right. It does.
It was. So it was great. It was my first one, though, and it was great. Honestly, it blew me away. I love the format. Maybe that's the groups guy in me, but the retreat vibe, the late night fire pits, Orange County in February is, not bad either, but it was amazing. And I came back and I told our team, I said, man, I've been to a lot of conferences in my years. I am older than you think. And, it was the best. It was definitely at the very top of the list, and I highly recommend it. So it was great.
And we didn't pay Bart to say that. And Bart and I met after one of the sessions, and it was around discipleship or something, and we happened to be near a table, and he introduced himself, and we got to chatting about discipleship and what they were doing. And I made a note of it to follow up with it. So it's just taken post-pandemic, a little bit.
Yeah, I haven't done anything in the last year. I've just been waiting. That's it.
Yes, exactly. Nothing's been happening in your life. So I do want to mention that we do have the lobby coming up again on February 23rd, 24th, and this one will be virtual. So maybe we'll have images of the fire pit. But the conversations, we really are focusing on allowing that kind of organic conversations to happen. So we have a ton of breakouts topics and people in separate rooms. And it's super affordable. You can watch and process with your team. You don't have to get on a plane. And there's still time to sign up. I checked that. So take a look on the Small Group Network website. I'll post the link on the show notes as well. And come join us. I think we have over 300. That's the plus side of doing it virtual. Is that we have room. We're not limited to the retreat center. We have room for that. But if you'd rather wait till 2022, you can join us in person. It'll be on February 22nd, 24th, or in the same time frame in lovely, warm Southern California. So, Bart, were you one of those Midwest people that were wearing shorts the whole time while I was in sweater and scarf and a full-length down jacket?
That's funny. No. Well, here's the thing, Carolyn, you need to know about Midwesterners. We take shorts with us anytime we go to a state outside of our own that's south or east or west. So anything but north, we bring shorts. I'm not crazy though. I think I have a little bit of California blood. I'm kind of a weather wimp. So it was gorgeous there, but I don't think I wore my shorts.
No, that was the Minnesota,
Yeah,
definitely the East Coast guys. That was pretty fun. You can always tell where people are from based on
it's funny.
that. So, Bart, as we dive into this topic of making disciples digitally, tell us a little bit about your church, Traders Point, and what the last year has looked like for your small groups ministry as you adapted to the pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to. So I think one thing that's helpful to know about our church is we are a 187-year-old congregation. So
Oh,
we
wow.
have made a few changes, over the years, just a few. And like everybody, we were caught off guard. I mean, we had talked about online groups. We had talked about an online campus. We had plans to develop both of those in about a year's time from when this all went down. And obviously God's plans were way quicker than ours. And so we were off to the races and trying to figure out how to get all of our groups online, how to attempt to equip leaders in a new way. We saw the opportunity early to address the initial shock and isolation people were experiencing. So we quickly launched short-term online groups. That was something new for us. And I remember talking to our team and putting the vision in front of us that we need to pray for 50 leaders. Like let's launch 50 groups to meet people in the midst of isolation. And we did. We prayed and we had to recruit leaders in like 48 hours. And I think we had over 100 leaders that responded in less than 48 hours that they were willing to. Most of these were existing group leaders, staff members that we said, hey, here's the vision. Here's what we think is going to happen. Would you consider leading an additional group online only for the next 8 weeks? And
So you handpicked them rather than just putting out a call.
We
Yeah,
pulled
that
from
makes
the
sense
pool.
for online.
We had to in such a short turnaround. And so we ended up launching maybe 60 of those groups with 400 people that signed up in just like a week's time. And so it was a beautiful mess. Most of them had never been in group before. And so there was a lot of bumps in the road, but it really met a need. And so that was something we stepped into. We did a lot of stuff that I think everybody probably did, right? So we did live training events, leveraged Facebook. We did watch parties. I think we realized it wasn't quite as scary or as hard as we thought it was going to be to make that move online. It was something that we were already leaning towards. And so it just forced us into it. And I think that's a great picture of what we're talking about today, discipleship, kind of getting forced into it before you're ready. And so as a church, we have been physically gathering since mid-September. We've regathered physically. We're seeing about 25, 30% of our people come back. Most of them are still online. It continues to grow there. Groups are still mostly hybrid and they're kind of group dependent, whether they're meeting physical or digital or some, hybrid in between. And I think that time that we've had has allowed us to rebuild and to focus on the gaps that we've seen. And so we've started to implement new types of content, trying to find better baby steps for new believers, obviously trying to leverage anything online that we can, addressing issues we're seeing like biblical illiteracy and creating new pathways for disciples and leaders. Like those have been things that have been like near and dear to us in the midst of this year that we're trying to take steps forward in.
Yeah, and we'll dive into that more specifically later in the program. But I know on our Facebook page, which you're also active on, so you've probably seen it as well, on the Small Group Network page, there's been conversations this January around how I think a lot of us that did have that little initial spark of the newness of, Zoom meetings and kind of when we thought it was only going to last like 2-3 months.
Right.
And then kind of this long haul has taken a toll. And I think there's been conversation on our Facebook page about how difficult it's been to get new leaders on board this fall. Certainly in January, it's been really an uphill for us at our church. And I was not happy, but glad to see, Misery Loves Company, glad to see that, we weren't alone in that. A lot of churches, have you noticed that kind of a plateauing effect now that we've been in this for so long?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you're not alone. I think we're all feeling that. It's been a really difficult season, and it's a good question to consider. I think there's lots of reasons why that has happened. I think ultimately, when I think about it, I think it's because it's hard. I think life is very hard, and it's simplified in some ways, right? But it gotten exponentially harder in others. So Zoom fatigue, of course, is a real thing. Virtual calls, people are on all day, is taxing. It takes more out of you. People aren't disconnected from work. They're trying to do e-learning with kids. There's that general sense of isolation and depression and all the tensions we faced in this year. And I think, honestly, people just kind of want to curl up in the corner with a blanket
Yes.
and wait for the storm to pass. And we realized a few weeks in, like, yeah, that's not going to work. And so, I've had a lot of conversations, Carolyn, with people in our church in this season. And the best way that I think I can explain this phenomenon is that it feels like death by a million paper cuts.
Mm.
If you break your arm, it's obvious, right? Your arm's broken.
Right.
It has to be dealt with. There's a box for that. Like, this is a process for that.
Exactly.
If grandma dies, you have a box for that. Like, you need to deal with that grief. But in COVID, it's severely truncated. It's convoluted, and so there's no box for pandemic. There's no box for racial political tension, right? There's no box for these things, for isolation and debates on masks and overreactive social media vomit that we all see all the time.
Right.
And so I think what I've had to help people do is just sit down and realize, when they look down, I said, bro, you're bleeding out. Like, it's death by a million paper cuts. And I think that contributes to the problem that we see, where people are reluctant to take on another thing. They don't know how to deal with everything they're facing. And so it really points to that issue. And I think it's really a deeper problem, which is the problem that we find in our church with the deficiency in discipleship. And I know that's what we want to talk about. I mentioned to you earlier that there's a study that came out from discipleship.org and Exponential on the state of discipleship in the US. And it's staggering. It's sobering on a lot of levels.
Yeah, that study is beyond sobering. I'm looking at it going, oh goodness. But actually, it wasn't that surprising, was it, Bart?
No, not really. I mean, if you follow research and data, I know you love that stuff too. They mostly all tell the same story. I just think it's a story you don't always want to hear. And so we need to create a new story, but it should cause us to draw some pause and do something different. And hopefully we can make some progress in that today.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So, if you wouldn't mind kind of breaking down that study, and because it's not just this one study, as you point out, I mean, it really is. We've been hearing about this, the alarm bell on discipleship and Bible literacy, and just what we're calling discipleship. I mean, the squishiness that we've embraced with that word itself is problematic. I mean, that conversation has been going on for years, and I can tell you, at every lobby, we have a breakout around it, and that is always full. And that's usually the topic that's around the fire pits too. I mean, we're all wrestling with it, no matter what kind of church we're at, and how long we've been doing the job. I think this is really central. Obviously, discipleship is central for everyone. So, but that study gives us a handle, and I'll link that in our show notes as well. But if you wouldn't mind giving us kind of a brief summary of some of the key findings that they did in that study, and we can kind of talk through that and see what our learnings might be.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'd love to do that. And again, I had no involvement in the study other than I'm a reader of it, like many of you would be. And it's made for us to be able to stomach it pretty easy, even though the nature of what we're covering is sometimes difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole thing is immensely relevant for us as small group leaders, because if small groups don't aid in discipleship, then they're not offering anything different than the world is already providing. And so we have to figure out ways to get this done digitally, physically. And so I love that. And so when I look at the data, so I'll just kind of break it down here. So they surveyed thousands of pastors and their churches, and then they placed churches into 5 kind of well-defined markings from 1 to 5 on their ability to make disciples and multiply. So level 1 is the type of church that they quantified as a church that is subtracting from disciple-making efforts. So they are going backwards, right? This is 29% of churches in the U.S. So almost a third. I know it's already starting off bad, right? So almost a third of them, which is surprisingly similar to what Barna has recently put out. If you've seen that 30% of churches will close in the next 2 or 3 years, or whatever that stat was. It's heartbreaking. Level 2 were churches then that have plateaued. So neither helping nor hindering disciple-making efforts. Now, this was a huge chunk, 44%. So here we're already looking at the first 2 categories, level 1, level 2, being 3/4 of all churches in the United States.
Right.
Pause. So level 3 then begins to move the needle a little bit. So level 3 churches that they found were churches that were adding disciples by church programs. So they were increasing numerically. They're adding. There's a lot of verbiage that goes with that. So I'd encourage the listeners to go ahead and check that out.
Sure.
That was 27%. of the churches. So if you're a mathematician, you would already do the math and realize that's 100%. So we've covered 100% of all the churches in those first three levels. So there's a little caveat. So level 4 would be churches that are reproducing personal disciple makers. Now, out of that 27% that is growing and adding, 5% of the total of those are also that level 4 church, so a little less than. So we have 4 point something percent of churches in the U.S. are reproducing personal disciple makers. They're making people who are making some disciples. And then level 5 is that next level, which is multiplying personal disciple makers. This is what we could call a disciple making movement. These are happening all around the world.
Yes.
But when they looked around the country and they interviewed thousands of churches and pastors, they found zero evidence of a disciple making movement in the U.S. That pains my heart.
It's very sobering.
Yeah, very sobering. So that's difficult. Those are difficult findings. And I think the report was done really, really well. And so, I mean, there are a couple more things that they pulled out of that. Those are the big ones, of course. But I think what they saw was that some of the problems were there's a lack of commonly understood definitions. So every culture needs a language. Like if there's not clear language, then it's really hard to know what you're talking about. It's hard to gauge effectiveness if you don't know that you're talking about the same thing. And church is notorious for that, especially with discipleship.
Right. And it's interesting, even across churches, if we were to ask 10 pastors to define it, you would probably get 10 similar-ish answers. But I think even within a church staff, even if you have 5 people, you ask what is disciple?
Mhm.
What is a disciple? What is disciple making? What's disciple maker? I think you may end up with slightly different variations. So I actually really like the definition that they came up with.
Yeah, it's really good. And that's what they're suggesting. We know there's not a perfect definition for disciple, but there probably are more useful ones than others. And so the one they gave is from Matthew 4:19. And I love that, where Jesus says, "Come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And so the definition they give is a follower of Jesus, being transformed by Jesus and committed to the mission of Jesus. So this is a person who is following him intentionally, being changed by him in his spirit, in alignment with his mission. And that's a beautiful, comprehensive definition of what a disciple is. And so if we can lock in on that, that helps already win some of that battle, as opposed to having 50 different definitions. And if we're trying to make that thing, we're making it slightly different.
Yeah, and their emphasis on the relationships and intentionality, like they talk about that quite a bit. And I liked their phrase was these churches, and they don't pull any punches. These churches are guilty of intent without impact, because there was such a disconnect between what pastors were reporting. When they asked pastors, "Do you think you're making disciples?" the numbers were huge. And then when they actually tested it, the numbers were really low. And there's this cognitive distance between the two. And they say it's because we may have that desire or that intentionality, and we're grading ourselves on that rather than the actual impact.
Mm-hmm. And Carolyn, we have a word for that. It's called pastor math, right? So we've all been a part of this to some way, shape, or form. And you're right. That is one of the big findings they came out with, was that pastors are overly optimistic in their assessment of disciple making cultures. And so we have to come to grips with the fact that we say, yeah, we have this many people making disciples, but when we look at the fruit and the things that are measurable, they're just not there to back it up. And so we have to find ways to face that and get better at it. And they give us some recommendations.
They do. And if our listener wants to do a quick gut check on this with no judgment whatsoever, just you and God, the study says that the average pastor spends 9% of their work hours on personally equipping people to make disciples. 9%. So think about that for a second, and think about how much time you do or don't spend on personally equipping people. So not necessarily running programs, but doing this personally. And that also can be a bit convicting as well. And that's reflective of the fact that we all say we're making disciples. We want to make disciples who make disciples. Like 100%, everyone listening to this would agree with that statement. The Great Commission, but it doesn't bear out. So I know you and your team have been doing some deep thinking and discussion around how groups can make disciples leveraging technology and doing it more digitally. So what have you been learning, and what changes have you implemented?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I mean, I think everyone can answer that. Yes, we've all been trying to find ways to implement that and to do it better. So I think one thing for us as Traders Point, as a church, we've realized that this is not a 1 year or so blip on the map. It is a true shift. we will look back in the history books, and this will be a shift when I think the digital age truly came into being, and it really had some massive implications on society. And this phygital is the word that we use, right? This physical digital, this phygital church that
That
we're
doesn't
trying.
really roll off the tongue well.
No,
I
it
know,
doesn't.
I know. I've been reading that in the media. I'm like fidgetal. It just is kind of bulky.
It is. We use it all the time. There's not a better word. If you have one, submit it. We'll put it in the definition glossary somewhere. But so this digital church that we are working to build and adapt, it's not going away. And so churches that don't get that, sadly, won't be effective, and many of them won't be here in the near future. That's the sad reality. And so we have to face it. So if we use this we use this digital lens in everything that we do. So all of our approaches now, from our online campus, even staffing our online team and groups, online groups, pastors. I mean, to engage people in digital and physical ways, that's the lens that we're using. And groups, of course, are no different. I think we're waking up to this somewhat shocking reality that doing church doesn't really disciple people, not the way that we did it before. And so people disciple people. That's always been true. It should have been more obvious. I think we knew that, but we have to really keep that in front of us. People disciple people. And so we're getting creative about using online group type environments as a new front door, starter groups, watch parties, things like that to meet people. Whatever that medium is, we want to leverage it for the gospel and for disciple making efforts. And so we've worked really hard to tackle our cultural wave of biblical literacy, moral relativism, the stuff that we're all facing. And we're getting ready to launch some discipleship tracks and cohorts that we think are going to better equip our people in Christian doctrine, Christian practice, attempting to try to address some of those clear deficiencies that we are seeing as we're kind of rebuilding a lot of things.
Yeah. Okay. So I have gosh, that's a lot. Makes me want to be at Traders Point. It sounds exciting.
Come on over. It's a great place, I promise.
It's a
Amazing.
tad cold for me.
Yeah, I know. There's no beach here either. My wife reminds me of that sometimes.
Yes. But, well, let's drill down a little bit. So when you talk about the online group piece, do you have dedicated online group pastors? I know you're at a size big enough where you can do that.
Right.
And when you say you're now gearing everything towards that digital space, walk us through what that looks like.
Yeah, we do. We do have staff dedicated. So when we launched the online campus, we've always had stuff for recent years anyway, online, but we
Yes.
really made it a robust, full-fledged campus. So we view it as a full campus. We've staffed it. We have a campus pastor. We have people that are working chat hosts and helping people go through baptism. And we've tried to create and figure out a lot of things that I think a lot of people, especially our size, are trying to figure out because of the resourcing to do it. And so we have online only groups. And this is the balance we're trying to figure out. So we have right now, all of our groups are kind of online anyway, or at least some
Yes.
semblance of that. So
Yes.
at what point are they a part of the online campus, or what part are they a part of our local campuses? And I don't know that we've figured that out yet, but we do have teams and people that is their job. Like, they are helping raise up leaders who are only online connected, whether they live in our city or outside our city. Again, we have people connecting from all over the world as well. And so trying to help them wherever they're at, really have a robust, life-giving relationship, even in a digital space. And
So you're
that's
not trying to push that online people into, because before 2020, I think the idea was that the online piece was a supplement, and that if ideally they would maybe use that as a front door, watch a service, join a group, and then they would eventually show up on campus.
Right.
But now the way you guys are thinking of it, and I think this is the future, that they're going to be permanent citizens of the
Yep.
online space, and you don't ever expect to see them show up at your door.
You're exactly right, Carolyn. I mean, we used to say, like, online is a great place to start, not a great place to stay. And we've stopped saying that because
Yes.
it has changed. Culture has shifted in such a way that for us to be relevant. Now, we know there's tremendous advantages in person that you still can't get online. We know that.
Right.
There are deficiencies, but we're not throwing that baby out the bathwater. And so we know that there's too much fruit to be had there. It is our definitive front door. It is the way that people are coming to us and connecting that wouldn't come into a campus, even if they live near one. And so, yeah, we're fine with people staying there. Now, there still is a desire, if they live close to one, to get them to a church is still a goal, but we're not saying that outright, because we know that there is enough value online that we can meet people there and adjust to those mediums in helpful ways.
And what are some advantages that you found that were surprising to the digital? Obviously, convenience. That you don't have to. For us, the drive. Commuting. You guys have snow to drive through, and all of that. So for trainings, actually, I haven't hated it.
No.
I miss the meal sharing. We used to have a big meal together. We used to have story time. So I miss some of that, and organic hallway kind of environment. But the actual training piece, we actually have more people attending because it's more convenient, especially our older people.
Yeah, that's good. We've seen a little bit of everything. We're still trying to figure that out too. I think convenience is a big piece. We're seeing that people can now come that couldn't come before. And so like when you'd have people miss group, there's really no excuse anymore. I mean, I have guys that will come to my group, we'll meet distance, masked, physical, but there might be two guys that will be on the road or not ready to come in, or they're in quarantine or whatever. And so they're joining in via Zoom or whatever it is. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities for that. It does allow us to train people better. And I think we'll get into some of that too, because we've done things a little bit different. So we are the Christian belief and practice, and some of these cohorts and tracks that we're implementing are helping us create kind of new models for us to really empower people, hit that baseline of biblical literacy, and help them take next steps. And so we're implementing a new LMS, a learning management system. I know some churches probably use that, which has been a dream for a long time. I'm super excited about it. It's going to help us take steps to monitor where our people are at. So in the past, we do these trainings, we put them out there, and I don't know who took them or who didn't. I don't, we tell them 2 or 3 times, hey, if you didn't do the training, do the training, try to follow up one-on-one. It's been really hard to follow up with leaders. And so it will actually track a lot of those things for us. Where are people in their discipleship journey and growth? Where are our leaders in their ongoing development? Have they got these modules done? Have they responded? And so it's interactive. So our team's working on that right now. And that's something that we're super excited about.
Did you build that in-house? Or did you buy it somewhere?
No, I'm not 100% sure, actually. And if people want to reach out at the end here, I'll get you connected with the people that know. It's outside my pay grade and league. So we have a lot of smart people.
I know I know there's stuff out there that because I've seen it on our Facebook too, that people that do track it digitally for people. But are you talking, when you talk about these cohorts, are you making smaller, smaller like 2-3 people, like discipleship groups kind of thing?
Yeah, no, good question. No, it's really actually larger. So it's a little bit different, and it can be done in a phygital way. So they can be done by a group itself to go through. So they have 2 modules, Christian beliefs, Christian practices. Each one's got 6 components that cover kind of those basic Christian theology, doctrine, and then Christian practice, missional living, that kind of stuff. And so we just realized there's such a deficiency there. We want our groups and our core people to know, like, hey, this is how you can begin to be discipled. And this is an important piece of that. So they can be done as a group. It can be done as an individual. They can be done in large learning environments, virtual learning environments, any combination of those. And so we're beginning to roll those out internally now so that we can then roll them out externally here in the fall and then the beginning of next year.
And are you drawing from your existing small groups for that? Or just is it a whole separate program?
Yeah, it's separate, but it will dovetail. So they'll work together. So that discipleship piece and small groups are kind of coming together, and we're trying to figure out how to blend that really well. So people could not be in a group and still go through Christian belief, Christian practice, or a group, like I said, could go through it together. So we'll continue to evaluate like how effective that is and how we can blend those really well. But we'll see them as core pieces that we really want everybody to go through, because again, that baseline is just not there. As we see new believers coming and unchurched people come to our church, we realize that there's just a big gap. And so how can we help them get there? It's hard with group leaders to train them all the same way and expect that the exact same thing's going to happen. And so we need to create some ways for that to happen outside of that, which is partly what this is answering.
It's interesting in the study, they talk about the level 3 people or churches, and part of level 3 churches, they say, is there's a little bit of movement, but they say that discipleship has primarily in North America been defined as programs, and that's the danger we fall into. Not that you guys are going to do this, but I thought it was worth mentioning because I think sometimes we fall in the trap of the busyness or the productivity, because that makes us feel good, of doing the programs. And then we kind of shy away from actually measuring the results. And so the relational piece, I think, helps drive that. And the accountability you're talking about is sure that it's not just a program intellectual exercise that they can just check off, but it actually is manifesting in their life. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And we're very aware of that. And you hit the nail on the head, Carolyn. I mean, that's one thing I would say is discipleship is not consumed. It's lived out. Right? You don't just consume and become a disciple. You have to live it out. It's life on life. And I think we do often as the church default to knowledge. So 10% of our learning and growth is knowledge. So statistics will tell us that. And the other 90% is coaching and experience. So how do we get environments where people are in labs, they're learning, they're actually doing the things that Jesus called them to do, and they're debriefing those things. They're getting pushed out a little bit before they're ready.
So you'll have experiential pieces to that.
There'll definitely be experiential lab pieces. It's not just content, especially in Christian practice, but like they're designed to be more life on life. And so we'll have to figure out how to keep that in front of us. I think honestly, that will be one of our biggest challenges, because again, the default is just to default to knowledge and information. And that will not get us the disciples that we're lacking in that survey and across the board.
Do you think it's a progression, like they need to know A to do B to do C, or do you think it happens all at once? I asked that because we recently had a conversation on our leadership team about whether we have, because we have a discipleship pathway-ish thing, but then we find that, especially in the last year, that people are entering all sorts of different places. Some people enter through service, a serving project. They may not even be Christians, may not know much about Jesus, but they really like how we're serving kids with special needs, and they'll just pop in that space first. Some people might start in a small group first because they have a friend. Some people pop in by watching the service first. I mean, there's a lot of different pieces, and then we're like, well, how do you, but then we have this discipleship track that kind of starts with the Christian worldview and that kind of thing. And so we were like, well, we want people to engage however way they engage, but then they also do need some basic pieces. So there's like a tension there.
Yeah, there is for sure a tension there. And there's exceptions to every rule, but I think we do have to push them to that pathway. Create a simple, reproducible, effective pathway that people can see. And I think if they do, they know how to progress. And that's the hard part, because you don't want it to be, I've leveled up to this tier and all that kind of stuff. But it is something really empowering and powerful about having a clear, reproducible pathway. And that's what we've tried to do, just kind of 3 steps on a pyramid to help us get like from one step to the next to the next. And so I think people can come in at different spots, and there will be plenty of exceptions to the rule, but the normal masses will probably move in a pretty sequential way that will be able to help funnel. And a lot of that comes down to creating the culture for that, right? It has to be your common language. It has to be what you normalize. It has to be, the type of the things you put resources behind to make it happen.
Yeah, that's the hard part. So what advice would you give to our listeners who want to take steps to disciple people digitally beyond just having the basic online groups?
Hmm. Advice. There's a ton. You can't afford not to. You can't afford not to. Now, you might not be the innovator. You might not be the early adopter in the whole diffusion of innovation progression.
Or not tech savvy. I think that part's a
Exactly.
little frightening for people.
Right. And it is frightening. And people are going to have to press out of their comfort zone, and they're going to have to bring people along that can help them. I mean, my son is 14 and he's the tech whiz of our house now. I've relinquished that title. He takes it over. So leverage the next generation. But so in that cycle, though, you cannot afford to be a laggard. You cannot be behind in this. So we've got to find ways to leverage technology, to innovate on our methods. I think there's just too much writing on it. I believe that this shift will birth tremendous innovation in the church to meet our culture. And we've just got to think in those terms. I think it was Jim Carroll who said that the title of his book, or to think big, start small, scale fast. Like that's kind of the advice I think that we're trying to adopt as a culture at Traders Point. And I would just submit that to our listeners. Like, think big, start small, scale fast, pray hard. Maybe I'll throw that one in there too to Christianize that, but it's true.
Nice.
True. And so I think those are the type of things that we're trying to really step into, but you can't afford not to.
Yeah, that's true. That was more, instead of advice, that was more like a prophetic call.
Whatever you want to call it.
You can't afford not to. And I've actually toyed around with maybe asking our small group leaders, because of that 9% thing, to deliberately, intentionally choose, 1 or 2 people.
Yes.
And just because they feel like they need to care for everyone equally. And though we train them that you don't need to, they still kind of default there, and they want everyone to be comfortable and everyone to be in the same space. I'm like, then not everybody is in the same spiritual space to move forward or hungry at the same level.
Right.
And so I think just even starting small, to your point, starting small would be to say, hey, so if you have 20 groups, 30 groups, 50 groups, whatever, imagine, you would have, if every small group leader picked one person in their group. And I know we called it apprenticing and all these other things, but maybe even more basic than that, right, Bart? Not even like to raise them up as small group leaders, but just to raise them up as a disciple.
I love that, Carolyn. Yes. And I would agree that that's something that we need to do and could do better, because the reality is, if you're not doing it that way, you're not doing it like Jesus did. He did that. He didn't treat all his disciples the same way. There was a difference there. And so I think we need to have that mentality. And one of the things that we try to fight through, so like our baseline for everything in our groups and where we try to point people to help them grow, is to really live out what Jesus said at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7. He gave us the wise and foolish builder story, right? And he said, the wise builder is the one who hears my words and puts them into practice. And so that's really what we try to help people do. How do you listen to the voice of God, and how do you respond? It's a game changer when you allow the Holy Spirit to speak and you give people space to do that and learn how to process, to be still, to know that He is God. It changes everything. They begin to hear things they didn't hear before, and they begin to have to be faced with the obedience of, this is an application question at the end of a study. This is God
Right.
saying something to me, and I have to face whether or not I'm going to do it or not. And then I have to be accountable to a friend or a few friends or my group. And so we really try to point people in that direction, because we believe that's where discipleship happens. That's where fruit happens, is when we are obedient, right? Teach them to obey. It's the whole Great Commission stuff. So that's what we're trying to do too. And I think that's a great idea, to find someone or a couple someones and start small. Just go.
And that's true for us as small group ministry peeps, as point leaders, that if the modeling piece of it, you can't get away from it. If we're only spending 9% of our time actually doing this, and then we're
Right.
telling them to spend a lot of time doing it, it's not gonna bear fruit. I think
Yep.
we need to kind of put ourselves in the trenches too, which is harder and more vulnerable and messy. Beautiful mess, I think we called it earlier.
Yes. Yes.
But the beauty is that God's in it. And so the mess is worth it. So Bart, thank you so much for this conversation. I was wondering, and I'm
Mhm.
putting you in the spot now, if you
Um,
have to be part of your church to get to see kind of what these modules you're talking about are, if there's a way to take a look at them. Otherwise,
Yeah, good question. I will gladly give you whatever we have. Nothing is published yet for that.
okay.
And so there are some things that we're doing internally that it's getting very, very close. And so you can go to our website, tpcc.org. You can even go /group-leaders for some of our group leader training and content. Some of that's getting updated in light of a lot of the changes we're making
Oh,
too.
great.
But there's stuff there. If we can be of any help to anyone, I mean, we want to make the kingdom better. So feel free to reach out. And once we get those things, we'll send them along. So some of it still has to be completely fleshed out to see how effective it is, but we really believe we've got something that will be helpful for our people.
Maybe we want to wait a few months and see you make all the mistakes, and then we can learn from that. And then we'll have
Gladly.
part two. Okay, what Bart has learned from this venture, so that we always want to kind of learn from other people's
Yeah.
mistakes rather
We'll
than make
tell
our
you.
own.
We'll
But
tell you
yeah,
how we failed. Yep.
well, we'll do. I'll link that in the show notes as well. And so, thank you for your generosity to the Church Big C in sharing that resource. So, Bart, if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm available, Facebook, Instagram, all that kind of stuff, not too hard to find. The best way is probably email. So just email me, bshaw, so BSHAW @tpcc.org. And if I can't help you, if there's someone on my team that can, like I said, we want to collaborate. We've got a lot of talented people here, and we love the kingdom. We love the Big C Church. So if we can learn something or fail at something that can help you, let me know. I'd love to connect you.
That's so great. That's the heartbeat for our network anyway. And Bart is part of the network in Indianapolis. So if you are in the area, hit him up for that and join that huddle. And you can also interact with him on the Facebook page as well. So Bart, thank you so much. God bless you and your ministry.
Oh, thanks, Carolyn, so much. It's been great to be on here with you. This was fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening to Here to There. And until next time, remember, we are better together.
Thank you for listening to Here to There, part of the Group Talk network of podcasts. If you like what you've heard, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more, make sure you check out smallgroupnetwork.com for more resources.